I gave my daughter a flower shop so she could recover after her husband died. When I came to get the flowers, she was crying. Her mother-in-law had taken over the shop, forced her to do all the dirty work for free, and made fun of her. I acted quickly. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Calvin Foster. I am 65 years old, and for 4 decades I made my living in commercial acquisitions. My career was built in the shadows of boardrooms, identifying hostile takeovers, dismantling toxic assets, and severing financial liabilities. I retired to a quiet life, preferring faded denim jackets to tailored suits, wanting nothing more than to watch my 32-year-old daughter, Alyssa, find peace. 6 months ago, Alyssa lost her husband, Blake, in a catastrophic car accident. The light vanished from her eyes entirely. To give her a sanctuary, a quiet place to heal and rebuild her life surrounded by life itself, I purchased a commercial storefront through a blind trust. I handed her the keys to the building, allowing her to operate her business completely rent-free. I built the custom oak counter with my own hands. I painted the walls the soft sage green she had loved since she was a child. It was meant to be her safe haven. The overpowering stench of industrial bleach and rotting lilies assaulted my senses the absolute second I pushed open the heavy glass door of Petals and Prose. I had come to surprise Alyssa and check on the structural integrity of a display shelf I had installed last week. I expected to hear the soft hum of the refrigeration units and find my daughter arranging fresh hydrangeas. Instead, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with chemical fumes and the harsh, grating sound of laughter. I bypassed the front window displays and stopped dead in my tracks. Alyssa was on her hands and knees in the corner of the shop. She was wearing a stained, oversized t-shirt, aggressively scrubbing spilled potting soil from the baseboards with a coarse, bristled brush. I looked at her hands. Her knuckles were cracked raw and bleeding from the abrasive chemicals. She was shivering, her face pale and exhausted, looking completely hollowed out by physical labor and unresolved grief. Across the room, Blake's mother, Patricia, sat perched upon the custom oak counter I had painstakingly crafted. Patricia was 60 years old, draped in expensive cashmere, her wrists heavy with gold bracelets that clinked loudly against the wood. She was casually sipping a mimosa from a plastic flute, surrounded by 2 equally overdressed acquaintances from her local country club. They were laughing uproariously. Patricia did not look down at the woman scrubbing the floor. She simply snapped her manicured fingers in the air, the sharp sound echoing through the humid shop. "Get up and fetch us some more ice," Patricia commanded, her tone dripping with absolute disdain. She turned back to her friends, rolling her eyes dramatically. "I swear to you both, her sluggishness is just sheer incompetence at this point. She uses Blake's accident as an excuse to drag her feet on everything. It has been 6 months. It is time for her to get over it and pull her weight." My blood ran completely cold. The urge to cross the room, tear Patricia off that counter, and throw her out onto the pavement was an overwhelming physical pressure in my chest. But 40 years of dismantling hostile adversaries had taught me that brute force is messy and often leaves the victim in the blast radius. I forced my breathing to slow. I unclenched my jaw and stepped forward out of the shadows of the entryway. Patricia finally noticed me. Her sneer instantly morphed into a rehearsed plastic smile. She hopped off the oak counter, smoothing her cashmere sweater, and approached me with the exaggerated, overly loud voice one might use to speak to a confused, senile old man who had wandered off the street. She looked at my faded jacket, my worn work boots, and immediately calculated my worth as negligible. "Hello there, sir," Patricia announced, blocking my path to Alyssa. "Are we looking for something cheap for the wife today? We have some lovely discounted arrangements in the back." She aggressively shoved a wilting, overpriced bouquet of bruised roses into my hands. Before I could respond, she turned slightly toward her country club friends, raising her voice to ensure they heard her magnanimity. "It is a good thing I stepped in and bought this little shop," she boasted proudly. "I had to intervene to keep my poor, destitute daughter-in-law from ending up on the streets. Without my charity, she would be completely homeless by now." Bless her fragile little heart. I looked over Patricia's shoulder. Alyssa kept her head down, scrubbing the grout harder, a single tear cutting through the dirt on her cheek. I did not shout. I did not correct Patricia's delusional narrative. I simply nodded like the naive old man she assumed I was, and pulled my credit card from my wallet. I handed it to her. Patricia swiped the plastic through the merchant terminal on the counter with a satisfied smirk. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my eyes fixed on the small digital screen of the card reader as it processed the exorbitant transaction. The text on the glowing screen did not read Alyssa's Botanicals. The digital receipt confirmed the merchant identity as Palmer Enterprises, LLC. The legal operating entity of the business had been shifted. The sanctuary I had built for my grieving daughter no longer belonged to her. I took the dying flowers, offering Patricia a vacant smile, turned my back on the woman actively humiliating my only child, and walked out the door. The first chain of the conflict had just locked permanently into place. I walked halfway down the block and tossed the ruined roses into a municipal trash can. I climbed into the cab of my truck, locked the doors, and pulled my encrypted tablet from the glove compartment. The interior of the truck became my command center. I logged into the secure portal of the commercial trust that held the deed to the building. The brick and mortar still belonged to me. The property itself was completely secure, shielding Alyssa from rent. But the operating business, the legal shell that generated revenue and purchased inventory, had been entirely hijacked. I opened the county clerk's public business registry and initiated a deep audit of the LLC filings. The documents loaded onto my screen detailing a chilling truth. 2 weeks after Blake's fatal car crash, while Alyssa was heavily sedated under the care of a grief counselor, Patricia had filed an operating amendment. I stared at the digital signatures. Patricia had somehow manipulated a grieving medicated widow into signing a transfer of controlling interest directly during Blake's wake. The documents officially granted Patricia 51% ownership. The trap was incredibly insidious. If I acted on my paternal instinct, if I marched back into that shop and simply evicted the business from my building, I would be legally evicting my own daughter. Furthermore, because Patricia controlled the revenue, but Alyssa's name remained on the foundational paperwork shutting down the storefront, would leave Alyssa personally saddled with the LLC's mounting tax debts and vendor liabilities. Patricia had insulated herself by using my daughter as a human shield against financial ruin. A blunt attack would destroy Alyssa permanently. I needed a scalpel, and I needed to know exactly why Patricia had seized control. I kept my truck parked across the street, watching the shop through the tinted glass. 45 minutes later, a pristine luxury SUV pulled aggressively into the commercial loading zone, blocking the sidewalk. A man stepped out wearing designer sunglasses and a tight polo shirt. It was Patricia's eldest son, Lance. Lance was 35 years old, a man who had burned through 3 separate technology startups using other people's money. He walked into the shop as if he owned the entire block. I watched in cold, absolute silence as Patricia emerged from the back room. She was no longer holding a mimosa. She was carrying heavy wooden crates packed with premium wholesale floral inventory, exotic orchids, imported lilies, and high-end vases. Patricia loaded the crates directly into the trunk of Lance's SUV. Lance did not lift a single finger to help his mother load the heavy boxes. He simply leaned against the bumper, tapping impatiently on his phone. I turned back to my tablet and dove into the public routing numbers associated with Palmer Enterprises. I cross-referenced the vendor payment schedules with the local business registry. The grim reality materialized on my screen. Patricia was systematically draining the daily cash deposits and liquidating the high-value inventory of Alyssa's shop to secretly fund Lance's failing application startup. The mother-in-law was not just verbally and emotionally abusing my daughter. She was actively bleeding her dry, siphoning the profit from Alyssa's labor to subsidize the luxurious lifestyle of her favored incompetent son. The tension in my chest tightened into a cold, hard knot. The entire dynamic was clear. Patricia had seized the storefront to create an endless cash machine for Lance. If I confronted Patricia directly about the embezzlement, she held the 51% majority vote. She could simply change the locks, drain the remaining accounts overnight, and bar Alyssa from the premises, entirely leaving my daughter with nothing but the remaining debt. I could not attack the shield. I had to sever Patricia's financial leverage from the shadows without leaving a single fingerprint. I turned the ignition of my truck, pulling away from the curb as Lance sped off with the stolen inventory. The time for observation had ended. The time for ruthless excision had begun. The smell of stale grease and burnt coffee hung heavy in the air of the downtown diner. It was exactly 7 in the morning. The neon sign hanging in the window hummed a low, erratic buzz, casting long shadows across the cracked vinyl of the booth. I sat completely still, a cold cup of black coffee untouched in front of me. The door chimed and Evelyn Rossi stepped into the diner. She looked entirely out of place in her immaculate charcoal suit, her heels clicking sharply against the scuffed linoleum floor. Evelyn was my corporate attorney, a woman whose reputation in the commercial acquisitions sector was built on absolute unyielding ruthlessness. We did not exchange pleasantries. We did not shake hands. She slid into the booth opposite me, her sharp eyes scanning my face, instantly recognizing the cold determination settled in my jaw. I reached into the interior pocket of my faded denim jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I dropped it heavily onto the table. It landed with a dull thud, sliding precisely across the slick surface until it stopped inches from her perfectly manicured hands. Inside was the original commercial lease agreement for the building that housed the flower shop. Evelyn did not ask how my morning was going. She simply opened the envelope, extracted the heavy stack of legal documents, and laid them flat. "You look like a man who has decided to stop playing nice Calvin," she said quietly, her eyes already scanning the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. "I am done playing entirely," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, even cadence. "I need you to look at Section 4, Paragraph 2. Evelyn flipped to the designated page, her eyes darting back and forth across the text. A slow, dangerous smile crept across her face. I watched her read my mind, drifting back decades to a time when I had been the one sitting on the wrong side of a desk, staring at a document just like this one. 30 years ago, I survived a brutal corporate bankruptcy that nearly stripped me of everything I owned. I had trusted a handshake. I had believed in mutual goodwill. The hostile takeover that followed taught me a lesson forged in absolute fire. True power in this world does not reside in loud threats, aggressive posturing, or public screaming matches. True power lies quietly in the fine print. I learned to read every footnote to understand the lethal mechanics of commercial law and to use a contract not just as an agreement, but as a weapon. "This is a ghost clause," Evelyn murmured, tapping her expensive pen against the paper. "You structured the original lease under the strict condition that your daughter Alyssa maintained primary operational control of the limited liability company." "Exactly," I said. "As long as she held the reins, the rent remained an absolute fraction of market value, and the landlord absorbed all structural liabilities. It was a shield meant to protect a grieving widow. But the operating business has been hijacked. Patricia Palmer manipulated my daughter into signing away 51% of the company. The legal entity has fundamentally shifted. The protective umbrella is officially void." Evelyn leaned forward, the predatory instinct of a seasoned attorney fully awakened. "So we tear down the umbrella. I want you to trigger the triple net clause I instructed," leaning in to meet her gaze. "I want it executed with maximum prejudice." For a moment, the only sound between us was the clattering of plates from the diner kitchen. A triple net lease is the most aggressive mechanism in commercial real estate. It completely inverts the financial dynamic between landlord and tenant. By activating this buried clause, I was not merely raising the rent. I was legally shifting 100% of the building expenses directly onto Patricia's shoulders. Evelyn began doing the math out loud, her voice laced with dark amusement. "The rent quadruples to match the premium downtown market rate immediately. But that is just the beginning. Under a triple net structure, the tenant becomes solely responsible for all property taxes. They become liable for the comprehensive structural insurance premiums. They must pay for every single aspect of building maintenance, I nodded slowly. The industrial HVAC unit on the roof is 20 years old and failing. The property taxes were just reassessed by the city at a massive premium. The plumbing in the basement requires a complete overhaul. Under the new terms, Patricia Palmer is personally responsible for every single cent of those repairs. She will drown Evelyn, stated, closing the folder and sliding it into her leather briefcase. A business bleeding cash cannot absorb a six-figure liability shift overnight. This is financial asphyxiation, Calvin. It is brilliant and it is entirely legal. When do you want the execution delivered? By the end of business today, I replied, staring out the greasy window at the morning traffic. I want the courier to hand her that heavy envelope exactly at 5 o'clock. I want her to spend the entire weekend staring at those numbers, realizing that the golden goose she stole is actually an anvil tied around her neck. Evelyn stood up, adjusting her suit jacket. The notice will be drafted, notarized, and delivered by 5. She paused, looking down at me with a rare expression of genuine sympathy. Calvin, you realize that applying this kind of pressure to a cornered animal makes them dangerous. She is not going to just hand the keys back and walk away. She will lash out. Let her, I said softly. A cornered animal makes mistakes. I want her to panic. I want her to realize she is standing on a landmine. Evelyn turned and walked out of the diner, leaving me alone in the booth. I finally picked up my cold cup of coffee and took a slow sip. The physical sensation of the trap being armed settled deep in my chest. I thought of my daughter kneeling on the cold floor, her hands raw and bleeding from the industrial bleach, while that woman laughed and sipped her morning cocktail. Patricia Palmer believed she was a master manipulator. She believed she had executed a flawless theft against a helpless, grieving girl and her absent, ignorant father. She had no idea that she had just stolen the steering wheel of a car heading straight for a concrete wall. I spent the rest of the day walking the city streets, the rhythmic ticking of my watch, keeping time with the impending deadline. I did not feel joy. There was no elation in this process, only the cold, mechanical necessity of a surgeon removing a malignant tumor. 4 o'clock came and went. The afternoon sun began to dip behind the tall glass skyscrapers, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. At exactly 5:15, my cell phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was Alyssa. I answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear, expecting to hear confusion about a strange legal delivery. Instead, I heard the sound of my daughter hyperventilating, her voice completely shattered by sheer, unadulterated panic. "Dad," she sobbed, her words barely coherent. "Dad, you have to help me. Patricia is screaming. She locked me in the back cooler. She says if I do not do exactly what she demands right now, she is going to throw Blake away." My blood stopped moving in my veins. The trap had sprung, but the blast radius had violently shifted. Patricia had received the financial execution order, and instead of folding under the immense legal weight, she had instantly weaponized the most sacred, vulnerable thing remaining in my daughter's life. The conflict had just mutated from a bloodless corporate maneuver into a deeply personal hostage situation, and I was miles away. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, parked 3 blocks away from the shop, staring at the dashboard clock. It was 5:30 in the evening. The courier had delivered the commercial guillotine exactly 30 minutes ago. In my decades of hostile acquisitions, I had learned that human beings react to sudden financial suffocation in one of 2 ways. They either collapse completely under the weight of the liability, or they lash out with the blind viciousness of a trapped predator. I expected Patricia to panic. I expected her to call her lawyers. I expected her to drain the last of the daily operating cash and flee. I deeply underestimated the sheer depth of her cruelty. The phone resting in the center console vibrated so violently it rattled against the hard plastic. The caller identification displayed my daughter's name. I answered the call and pressed the phone to my ear, expecting to hear confusion about a legal notice she did not understand. Instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone choking on their own tears. It was a wet, ragged hyperventilation that instantly froze the blood in my veins. Alyssa could barely form words. Her voice was echoing, bouncing off metal walls, accompanied by the low, constant hum of heavy refrigeration compressors. She was hiding inside the floral walk-in cooler. She begged me to help her words spilling out in a frantic, terrified rush. She kept repeating that Patricia was going to throw him away. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, the leather creaked. I demanded she take a breath and tell me exactly what was happening. Through the muffled sobs and the hum of the compressor, the horrifying reality of Patricia's counterattack took shape. The courier had handed Patricia the dense manila envelope right at the front counter. Patricia had torn it open, expecting a vendor catalog. Instead, she found the legally binding notice shifting the entire tax maintenance and insurance burden of the property onto her illegally acquired limited liability company. The rent quadrupled instantly. It was a financial death sentence for a business already bleeding cash to fund her older son's failed ventures. But Patricia did not pack up her expensive cashmere and leave. She walked straight to the back of the shop, backed my grieving daughter into the freezing confines of the walk-in cooler, and locked the heavy metal handle from the inside so the customers out front could not hear. She cornered her, and then she laid out her ultimatum. Blake was a young man when he died. Like many young men, he believed he had decades ahead of him. He had never updated his primary life insurance policy or his final directives after he and Alyssa were married. When his car was crushed by a drunk driver 6 months ago, his mother Patricia was still legally listed as his primary beneficiary and next of kin for his remains. Patricia had absorbed a massive life insurance payout, while my daughter was left to plan a funeral with nothing. I had purchased the flower shop building because I wanted to shield Alyssa from that exact financial ruin. But the money was not enough for Patricia. She held Blake's ashes. She controlled the deed to the historic Palmer family cemetery plot, where Blake had always explicitly said he wanted to be buried next to his grandfather. Alyssa wept into the phone, her teeth chattering from the cold air of the cooler. She told me Patricia had shoved the legal notice into her face, claiming the new landlord was trying to destroy their legacy. Patricia told my daughter that the business was entirely her responsibility because she was the one managing the inventory. Then came the demand. Alyssa had to go to the bank tomorrow morning and take out a $50,000 personal loan to cover the new lease requirements. I listened in absolute silence, the sheer audacity of the demand ringing in my ears. Patricia was attempting to force my daughter to finance her own extortion. She wanted Alyssa to assume a predatory high-interest personal loan to pay the rent on a building I owned, just so Patricia could continue siphoning the profits to her other son. Alyssa gasped for air, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. She told me what would happen if she refused. Patricia promised she would keep the life insurance money. She promised she would keep Blake's ashes. She looked my daughter right in the eyes and swore she would bar her from the family cemetery plot forever. She said Alyssa would never be allowed to visit her own husband's grave. She told her she would scatter Blake in a public park before she let a useless, sluggish widow ruin her business. My daughter was weeping on the floor of a freezing room, surrounded by dying orchids, held emotionally hostage by a woman who viewed her dead son's remains not as a tragedy, but as collateral. Patricia was perfectly willing to utterly destroy a grieving widow to protect her cash flow. She was weaponizing Blake's ashes to subsidize Lance's failed technology startup. I did not raise my voice. I did not betray a single fraction of the rage detonating inside my chest. I simply asked my daughter where Patricia was right now. Alyssa cried that she had gone to her country club dinner. She had locked Alyssa in the shop and told her to think very carefully about how much she loved her husband. Patricia told her the loan officer at the downtown branch was expecting her at 9 in the morning. She said if Alyssa did not come back with a cashier's check, she would pour Blake's urn down a storm drain. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. I had attempted to use a commercial mechanism to squeeze Patricia out of the shop gracefully. I had attempted to force a quiet bankruptcy. I had given her a door to walk through. Instead, she chose to construct a torture chamber for my child. The rules of engagement had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer a matter of corporate eviction. This was an extraction. I told my daughter not to argue with her, that my voice projecting a calm, steady authority that masked the violent calculus running through my mind. I instructed her to unlock the cooler door, to go home, and to ignore every single phone call from that woman for the rest of the night. I told her she would go to the bank tomorrow morning, exactly as Patricia demanded. Alyssa sobbed that she could not afford a loan like that it would ruin her, that she did not have the credit and the interest rate would crush her. I told her she was not going to sign a single piece of paper. I promised her I would be there. I promised her I would make sure Blake's ashes were secured and that she would never have to speak to that woman again. I told her to just go home and lock her doors. I disconnected the call and sat in the quiet darkness of the truck. The glow of the streetlights caught the edges of my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked older than my 65 years, but my eyes were entirely devoid of exhaustion. Patricia Palmer believed she was holding all the cards. She believed she had executed a flawless manipulation, utilizing the dead to enslave the living. But a hostage situation only works if the negotiator cares about the survival of the hostage taker. Patricia thought she was squeezing a helpless widow. She did not realize she had just invited a predator directly into her home. I started the engine of the truck, the heavy diesel rumble vibrating through the floorboards. I put the vehicle in gear and merged into the evening traffic. I had 12 hours before the bank opened. 12 hours to dismantle the final illusion of power Patricia held. She had crossed a line that commercial law could not rectify. She demanded a personal sacrifice from my daughter, and so I would extract a complete and absolute annihilation of everything Patricia Palmer held dear. I reached for my phone again and dialed my attorney. The commercial guillotine had failed to sever the threat. It was time to build a velvet noose. Now I pulled my truck into the angled parking space outside the First National Bank branch downtown. The morning sun glared harshly off the tinted glass facade of the building. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cab for a moment, steadying my breathing. The dashboard clock read 8:55 in the morning. Alyssa had been ordered to arrive the moment the doors unlocked. I knew exactly what was waiting for her inside. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the heavy revolving doors. The lobby was a sprawling cavern of polished granite and dark mahogany. The air conditioning was perfectly calibrated to create a crisp, sterile environment. It was a space specifically designed by architects to make ordinary people feel incredibly small and hopelessly intimidated. The hushed whispers of tellers and the soft clicking of keyboards echoed off the high ceilings. I scanned the vast open floor plan and immediately spotted my daughter. Alyssa was sitting in a low leather chair situated in front of a sleek glass desk in the far corner of the lobby. Across from her sat a young, ambitious loan officer, wearing a tailored blue suit and a rehearsed, sympathetic smile. He was leaning forward, pressing a thick stack of densely printed documents across the polished glass. Alyssa looked entirely broken. She wore the same oversized gray sweater she had slept in the night before. Her shoulders were hunched inward, as if she were physically trying to shield herself from an invisible, crushing weight. She held a heavy silver pen in her right hand. The metal hovered just inches above the final signature line on the last page. I watched her hand tremble. I remembered sitting at our old kitchen table decades ago, teaching her how to hold a pencil. I remembered guiding her small fingers as she learned to trace the letters of her own name over and over until she felt proud. I had wanted her to be confident. I had wanted her to own her identity completely. Now a predator was forcing her to use that exact same signature to bury herself alive under a mountain of fabricated debt. I moved across the lobby. My heavy work boots made absolutely no sound on the thick plush carpet. The loan officer was tapping his manicured fingernail against the desk, urging Alyssa to simply initial the bottom right corner so his department could expedite the wire transfer. Alyssa was crying silently. The tears fell from her chin and stained the pristine white paper. She whispered to the man that she just wanted Blake back. She whispered that she just needed to be able to visit her husband without being punished. The loan officer offered another empty smile, and pushed the silver pen closer to her fingers, telling her this was the fastest way to resolve her family troubles. He did not care about her grief. He only cared about his monthly commission quota. I did not announce my presence. I did not shout or create a public spectacle. I simply stepped directly behind my daughter and reached down. I gently, but firmly, took the silver pen from her trembling fingers. Alyssa gasped and looked up at me. Her eyes were red and swollen, filled with a sudden, terrifying panic that she had done something wrong. The loan officer stood up immediately, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face flushed with professional indignation as he demanded to know who I was and instructed me to step away from his client. I ignored him entirely. I picked up the thick stack of loan documents from the glass desk. The top page detailed an exorbitant predatory interest rate. It was a financial snare meticulously designed to extract maximum suffering and capital from a desperate, grieving victim. It was a contract of pure extortion. I gripped the heavy stack of papers with both hands and tore them straight down the middle. The sound of ripping paper was shockingly loud and violent in the quiet bank lobby. I dropped the torn halves onto the glass desk where they scattered in a messy pile. The loan officer began to sputter, threatening to summon the armed security guards standing near the vault. I looked directly into his eyes with a cold, hollow stare. It was a look I had perfected over decades of dismantling arrogant corporate executives in hostile boardrooms. I told him the application was permanently void. I told him that if he or his branch ever attempted to contact my daughter again, I would personally have my legal team audit his entire professional portfolio for predatory lending practices targeting vulnerable widows. He sat back down, instantly silenced by the absolute certainty in my voice. I knelt beside Alyssa. She was shaking violently, burying her face in her raw hands. She sobbed that Patricia was going to throw Blake away. She cried that she had to pay the extortion money right now, or Patricia would lock the ashes away in a vault forever and banish her from the cemetery plot. She was completely consumed by the terror Patricia had planted in her mind. I took her hands in mine. Her skin was still rough and peeling from the industrial bleach she had been forced to use on the shop floors the day prior. I looked her directly in the eyes, refusing to let her look away. I kept my voice incredibly steady, anchoring her shattered mind back to reality. I promised her on my life that Patricia Palmer would never touch Blake again. I promised her that her husband's ashes would be secured before the sun went down, and that she would have total permanent control over his resting place. I told her the era of being terrified was officially over. I pulled her gently up from the chair. I guided her toward the heavy glass doors of the lobby and told her to drive straight home and lock her doors. I told her to turn off her phone and ignore the rest of the world. She walked out into the bright morning sunlight, her posture slightly straighter, unburdened by the crushing financial chain she had almost locked around her own neck. I stayed behind for just a moment, watching the loan officer frantically pick up the pieces of the torn contract and dial his desk phone. I knew exactly who he was calling. The chain reaction had been officially ignited. By physically severing that pen and ripping that contract, I had completely starved Patricia's limited liability company. The massive wire transfer Patricia was desperately counting on to cover the quadrupled lease agreement and the suffocating new property taxes was dead. The lifeblood of her extortion had been surgically removed. Patricia was currently standing in the flower shop, waiting for a massive cash injection that was never going to arrive. Her grand scheme to use Alyssa as an endless reservoir of capital had just slammed into an impenetrable concrete wall. Without that loan, Patricia possessed absolutely zero liquidity. The brutal financial weight of the triple net lease was now resting squarely and entirely on her own shoulders. Patricia realized instantly that she could no longer extract money from her victim. The parasite had been forcibly and permanently detached from the host. But instead of retreating and admitting defeat, Patricia chose to accelerate her cruelty. Deprived of the cash she desperately needed to subsidize her older son, she abandoned all remaining pretense of keeping the shop running as a family business. If she could not bleed Alyssa dry, she decided to simply discard her entirely and liquidate whatever assets remained inside the building. The nuclear option was authorized. Patricia picked up her phone and called a commercial locksmith, preparing to physically bar my daughter from the premises. The battle had officially escalated from quiet financial manipulation to a total and absolute eradication. I drove my daughter away from the downtown bank plaza, navigating the dense morning traffic in absolute silence. The adrenaline that had flooded her system during the confrontation with the loan officer was rapidly evaporating, leaving her shivering and exhausted in the passenger seat. I walked her to the front door of her small house, instructed her to brew a pot of tea, and told her to lock the deadbolt behind me. I promised her the financial extortion was finished and that I would personally handle the fallout at the shop. I returned to my truck, my mind already calculating the immediate legal repercussions of the torn contract, but I had severely underestimated the velocity of a cornered predator. I had barely merged back onto the main commercial thoroughfare when my cell phone vibrated. It had been exactly 1 hour since I ripped the loan application in half. The retaliation was incredibly swift. Alyssa was on the line, her voice entirely different this time. The frantic panic had been replaced by a hollow, crushing defeat. Patricia had not waited for a phone call from the bank. The moment Patricia realized the wire transfer was dead and the $50,000 cash injection was not going to materialize, she called Alyssa and formally fired her from the business she had built. The parasite, realizing the host was no longer producing blood, simply discarded the body. Patricia told my daughter she had exactly 15 minutes to get her trash out of the store before she threw it into the municipal dumpster herself. I did not tell Alyssa to stay home. I told her I was already 5 minutes away and I would meet her there. I pulled my truck into the loading zone outside Petals and Pros. The scene in front of the building was a portrait of absolute calculated cruelty. My 32-year-old daughter was sitting on the dirty concrete curb, the morning traffic rushing past her. At her feet rested a single battered cardboard box containing her few personal belongings. I stared at the contents of that box. A framed photograph of Blake from their wedding day. A pair of high-grade gardening shears I had bought her for her birthday. A ceramic coffee mug. That was the entirety of what Patricia had allowed her to take from a business I had purchased to save her life. Alyssa was weeping quietly into her raw, bleach-stained hands, her shoulders shaking with the sheer indignity of being thrown out onto the street like garbage. I stepped out of my truck and looked at the storefront. A heavy utility van was parked haphazardly on the sidewalk. A commercial locksmith in a stained gray uniform was standing at the glass door, a heavy-duty power drill pressed firmly against the brass deadbolts. The high-pitched whine of the drill bit biting into the metal echoed down the street, sending vibrations through the pavement. I had installed those specific deadbolts myself 6 months ago. I had chosen the highest-grade reinforced brass I could find on the market, telling Alyssa I wanted her to feel completely secure when she closed up the shop at night. Now Patricia was paying a stranger to drill out my protection, systematically locking my daughter out of her own sanctuary. I looked through the glass. Patricia was standing directly on the other side of the door. She was wearing a tailored designer coat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was watching the locksmith destroy the locks, but her eyes were fixed directly on Alyssa sitting on the curb. Patricia was sneering. It was a look of pure, unadulterated malice. She had lost the bank loan, but she was extracting her compensation in emotional torture. She wanted Alyssa to feel entirely worthless. She wanted to prove that she possessed absolute control over the physical space, over Blake's memory, over the entire legacy of their family. The locksmith pulled the drill away, the ruined brass cylinder clattering onto the floor inside. He inserted a new core, tested the silver key, and handed it to Patricia. She took the new keys, held them up so I could see them through the glass, and offered a slow, mockingly sweet wave. She turned her back and disappeared into the back office, leaving my daughter crying on the pavement. I did not approach the glass. I did not bang on the door or demand entry. I did not scream threats through the window. I simply walked over to the curb and sat down on the cold concrete right next to my daughter. I wrapped my arm around her shaking shoulders and pulled her close. I held her on the pavement while the city moved around us. I let her cry for the sanctuary she had lost, for the husband who was gone, and for the sheer cruelty of the woman who had orchestrated this nightmare. But as I held my daughter, I felt a profound, fundamental shift in the architecture of the conflict. Patricia believed this lockout was her ultimate victory. She believed that by physically removing Alyssa from the premises and changing the locks, she had secured her undisputed reign over the limited liability company and the building itself. She thought she had severed Alyssa from the business, isolating her in grief and poverty, effectively winning the war. What Patricia Palmer utterly failed to comprehend was the tactical reality of a hostage situation. For the past week, my hands had been tied. I had been forced to operate with extreme caution, navigating the treacherous waters of commercial law with a scalpel because Patricia held my daughter inside the blast radius. If I had brought the entire weight of my financial leverage down on the business, while Alyssa was still attached to it, Alyssa would have been crushed by the collateral damage. Patricia had been using my child as a human shield, insulating herself from my retaliation, while she siphoned the profits to fund Lance's failed technology startup. By firing Alyssa, by forcing her out onto the street, and physically locking the doors, Patricia had voluntarily surrendered her hostage. She had legally and physically severed Alyssa from Palmer Enterprises. My daughter was no longer an employee. She was no longer an authorized operator. She was entirely, completely insulated from the corporate entity and its mounting debts. Patricia had just cleared the blast radius. I looked down at the cardboard box at my feet. The framed picture of Blake was resting on top of the gardening gloves. I looked at the new shiny locks on the glass door. The triple net lease was already suffocating Patricia's cash flow. The $50,000 bailout was dead. Lance was still demanding capital. Patricia was trapped inside a sinking ship, and she had just thrown the only innocent passenger overboard. I stood up and helped Alyssa to her feet. I picked up her cardboard box, the weight of it negligible compared to the emotional burden she had been carrying for 6 months. I walked her to the passenger side of my truck and opened the door. I told her we were going home, and I promised her she would never have to scrub that floor again. I told her the shop was no longer her concern. I closed the truck door and walked around to the driver's side. I looked at the storefront one last time. Patricia had claimed the physical space, but she did not own the earth beneath it, and she did not understand the financial storm gathering directly above her head. The defensive phase of this operation was officially concluded. The dynamic had completely inverted. I was no longer a father trying to protect his daughter from eviction. I was a commercial acquisitions specialist who had just been granted absolute unrestricted freedom to operate. I climbed into the cab and started the engine. I possessed the leverage, the capital, and the legal mechanisms to completely annihilate Patricia's limited liability company. I had the power to strip her of every single asset she owned, to publicly expose her embezzlement, and to crush her arrogant illusion of control into fine dust. The gloves were off. I shifted the truck into gear and drove away from the curb, leaving Patricia locked inside her own tomb. It was time to unleash the phantom contract. I left my daughter in the safety of her home and drove my truck back across the city line. The visceral anger that had gripped me on the pavement outside the flower shop was gone, replaced by the cold, sterile hum of corporate strategy. Patricia Palmer had evicted her only shield. She was now standing alone in a building I controlled, crushed beneath the weight of a commercial lease she could not afford, and desperate to secure cash for her parasitic son. It was time to give her exactly what she wanted. I returned to my home office, locked the door, and opened my encrypted laptop. I spent the next 4 hours resurrecting a dormant offshore holding company I had kept in reserve for over a decade. I stripped the old filing data and rebranded the entity as Apex Luxury Events. I did not simply register a name. I built an entire digital architecture designed specifically to bypass the superficial scrutiny of a woman blinded by country club status. I generated a flawless corporate website featuring high-resolution images of opulent galas, celebrity charity dinners, and elite philanthropic summits. I routed the contact numbers through a virtual switchboard in Manhattan. I created a roster of fictitious board members and populated their digital footprints with philanthropic awards and society page mentions. Apex Luxury Events looked like a multi-million-dollar behemoth that catered exclusively to the absolute upper echelon of high society. It was a perfectly constructed mirage, a digital ghost designed to reflect Patricia's ultimate fantasy of wealth and prestige back at her. By midnight, the trap was fully armed. The bait was set. Now I needed the perfect delivery mechanism. The following afternoon, Patricia was pacing the floor of her stolen flower shop. I sat in my truck down the block, monitoring the storefront through my binoculars. The panic was beginning to visibly erode her carefully maintained facade. The massive rent invoice was sitting on her counter. The aggressive property tax reassessments were looming. She had no bank loan. She had no skilled daughter-in-law to run the daily operations. She was trapped in a rapidly sinking ship, completely desperate for a miracle to bail out her failing enterprise and keep her son Lance in luxury. That is exactly when Evelyn Rossi walked through the front door of Petals and Prose. Evelyn had discarded her usual severe courtroom attire. She was dressed impeccably as a high-end corporate procurement officer. She wore a tailored white suit, a subtle but astronomically expensive watch, and carried a leather portfolio that practically radiated authority. I watched through the glass as Evelyn bypassed the cheap, wilting arrangements Patricia had haphazardly thrown together. Evelyn did not browse. She stood in the center of the room, exuding an aura of extreme impatience and vast wealth, and demanded to speak to the owner immediately. Patricia practically tripped over her own feet, rushing out of the back office. She smoothed her hair, plastering on her rehearsed plastic smile, instinctively recognizing that the woman standing in her shop represented serious capital. Evelyn did not offer a handshake. She introduced herself as the lead procurement director for Apex Luxury Events. She spoke quickly, utilizing sharp, dismissive corporate jargon that immediately put Patricia on the defensive. Evelyn stated that Apex was in the final stages of organizing a massive statewide philanthropic gala circuit for the upcoming season. She claimed their previous floral supplier had just been terminated for a minor breach of contract, and Apex was now in emergency need of an exclusive vendor to handle the entire circuit. Evelyn opened her leather portfolio and dropped a thick, glossy contract onto the oak counter. She told Patricia the numbers. It was a multi-million-dollar exclusive supply contract. The sheer volume of the order was staggering. Apex required thousands of premium rare orchids custom centerpieces for 50 separate high society events and exclusive access to Palmer Enterprises for the next 6 months. Evelyn casually mentioned that the contract included a massive upfront retainer, more than enough capital to wipe out Patricia's new lease liabilities and fund Lance's startup 10 times over. I watched Patricia's face through the binoculars. The desperate panic that had gripped her all morning instantly evaporated completely, consumed by a blinding, intoxicating wave of greed. She stared at the contract on the counter, as if it were a winning lottery ticket dropped directly from heaven. Patricia did not see a trap. She saw ultimate validation. She truly believed her own delusions of grandeur. She believed she was finally being recognized by the elite society she so desperately craved. But Evelyn was a master of psychological warfare. She did not let Patricia celebrate. Evelyn tapped her expensive pen against the contract and stated that Apex operated on a strict, merciless schedule. She looked around the empty, poorly stocked shop with visible disdain. She told Patricia that Apex required absolute perfection, and she expressed severe doubt that a small local storefront could possibly handle the crushing volume of a statewide luxury circuit. It was the perfect manipulation. By threatening to take the phantom millions away, Evelyn bypassed Patricia's logical defenses entirely. Patricia's arrogance flared instantly. She practically leaned over the counter, desperately assuring Evelyn that Palmer Enterprises was a massive, highly capable operation. She lied through her teeth, claiming she had a vast network of wholesale distributors and the infrastructure to handle any volume Apex required. Patricia begged for the contract, her greed completely overriding any basic business sense, to vet the company offering her millions of dollars out of thin air. Evelyn let the silence stretch, pretending to weigh the risks. She looked at her watch, sighed heavily, and told Patricia she would take a chance on a local vendor. But she laid out one uncompromising condition. Because of the extreme timeline, Patricia would have to source the rare orchids from a very specific premier international distributor that Apex mandated for all their high-end events. Evelyn told her the wholesale order had to be placed immediately, and Palmer Enterprises would have to secure the inventory themselves to prove they had the capital backing to partner with Apex. Patricia did not even hesitate. Blinded by the promise of the multi-million-dollar payout and desperate to secure the massive upfront retainer, she agreed to every single term. She nodded vigorously, her eyes fixed hungrily on the glossy contract. Evelyn slid the paperwork across the oak counter, leaving it in Patricia's trembling hands. Evelyn turned on her heel and walked out of the shop, her face an unreadable mask of absolute professional indifference. I watched Evelyn cross the street and disappear into the downtown crowd. I looked back at the storefront. Patricia was standing behind the counter, clutching the phantom contract to her chest, a look of sheer arrogant triumph plastered across her face. She immediately picked up her cell phone, undoubtedly calling Lance to boast about the miraculous fortune she had just secured for them both. She had no idea she was holding a loaded grenade. She had no idea that the international floral distributor Evelyn had just mandated was a private entity entirely controlled by my own commercial holding company. Patricia Palmer had just eagerly and voluntarily stepped directly onto the execution block. The trap was locked, and the countdown to her absolute financial ruin had officially begun. The glow of my encrypted monitors illuminated the dark mahogany of my home office. The phantom contract I had dispatched through Evelyn was not merely a stack of paper. It was a perfectly engineered labyrinth designed to isolate and exhaust its prey. Patricia Palmer had eagerly snatched the bait, believing she was ascending to the upper echelons of high society. She had spent the entire evening on the telephone, boasting to her country club friends about her multi-million-dollar exclusive partnership with Apex Luxury Events. She was intoxicated by the illusion of her own brilliance. But illusions do not procure inventory. The reality of commercial supply chains is a brutal, unforgiving mechanism. Hidden deep within the 45 pages of the Apex contract was a strict exclusivity mandate. Evelyn had drafted the clause with absolute precision. It explicitly stated that to maintain the elite standard required for the statewide philanthropic galas, the floral vendor was legally obligated to source their core materials from a singular approved international distributor. The contract demanded thousands of ultra-rare ghost orchids and specialized bromeliads. These were delicate, exotic specimens that could not be purchased from local greenhouses or regional wholesalers. The mandated distributor was listed as a premier agricultural exporter operating out of Bogota, Colombia. What Patricia did not know, what she could not possibly trace through the labyrinth of international shell companies, was that I wholly owned that South American distribution network. I had acquired it 12 years ago to streamline supply lines for massive corporate acquisitions. It was a silent, heavily fortified piece of my financial empire. Patricia was required to buy the flowers from me to fulfill a contract I had fabricated using money she did not have. The vice began to close the moment the sun rose. Through the digital surveillance overlay I had legally installed on the store network before giving the shop to my daughter, I watched Patricia initiate the purchasing protocol. She sat at the custom oak counter, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand, exuding supreme arrogance. She dialed the international number for the Bogota distributor, fully expecting them to grovel for her business. She assumed the mere mention of the Apex Luxury Events contract would grant her immediate, unrestricted access to their premium inventory. My floor manager in Bogota, a man trained to handle aggressive corporate negotiators with absolute emotional detachment, took her call. Patricia arrogantly rattled off the massive order requirements, demanding priority shipping and immediate processing. She spoke to him as if he were a subordinate, instructing him to put the entire order on a net 90-day payment schedule so she could collect the Apex retainer before paying her bills. My manager did not flinch. He calmly informed Patricia that they did not extend credit to unverified independent storefronts. He stated their corporate policy with lethal politeness. To secure a wholesale shipment of that magnitude, the distributor required a 50% upfront deposit. The invoice for the exotic orchids totaled $200,000. Patricia was required to wire $100,000 in liquid cash by the end of the business day, or the inventory would not be cut. I watched Patricia completely freeze on the security feed. The arrogant smile melted off her face, instantly replaced by the cold, creeping realization of logistical gridlock. She demanded to speak to a supervisor. My manager simply reiterated the payment terms and disconnected the line. The trap had seamlessly transitioned from a psychological lure into a crushing financial vice. Patricia hung up the phone and frantically logged into the Palmer Enterprises banking portal. I watched the keystrokes register on my monitoring software. She pulled up the master ledger for the limited liability company she had stolen from my grieving daughter. The numbers staring back at her were a death sentence. For months, Patricia had treated the flower shop as a personal piggy bank. She had systematically drained the daily cash deposits, bleeding the operating reserves entirely dry. Every time a customer purchased a bouquet, every time an event invoice cleared, Patricia had aggressively siphoned the capital into offshore accounts to fund her older son Lance and his disastrous technology startup. She had completely stripped the business of its liquid assets to subsidize his failure. The master ledger displayed an available balance of exactly $1,200. She needed $100,000 before sunset. I watched her completely unravel. She paced the length of the shop, her manicured hands pulling anxiously at her expensive cashmere sweater. She was trapped in a financial paradox of her own making. She was holding a contract worth millions of dollars, but she was entirely blocked from executing it because she had robbed her own company blind. The millions were sitting behind a locked door, and she had personally melted down the only key. Desperation took the wheel. She picked up her cell phone and dialed Lance. I listened to the audio feed as she frantically explained the situation. She demanded that Lance immediately wire $100,000 back into the shop accounts. She pleaded with him, explaining that this Apex contract would make them both incredibly wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. She just needed the seed capital returned to secure the exotic orchids. Lance reacted with the predictable cowardice of a pampered failure. His voice whined through the phone speaker, defensive and agitated. He told his mother that the money was completely gone. He had already locked the stolen funds into long-term server leases and aggressive digital marketing campaigns that were burning cash by the hour. He could not liquidate the startup capital. He told her she was the business genius who stole the shop from her daughter-in-law, so she needed to figure out the supply chain on her own. Lance hung up on his own mother, leaving her standing in the dead silence of the empty storefront. The vice tightened another rotation. Exactly 10 minutes later, Evelyn called Patricia, acting in her role as the Apex procurement director. Evelyn did not ask how Patricia was doing. She demanded a status update on the supply chain confirmation. Evelyn coldly reminded Patricia that the first major gala was less than 2 weeks away. Apex required absolute proof of inventory procurement by tomorrow morning. Evelyn stated that if she did not receive the official invoice receipt from the Bogota distributor within 24 hours, Apex would legally void the contract for failure to perform and immediately award the millions to a rival vendor. I watched Patricia physically sag against the oak counter as the call ended. She was suffocating. She could not walk into a traditional bank and ask for a commercial loan because I had already intercepted Alyssa and ripped up the paperwork. She could not use the physical building as collateral because the commercial trust remained entirely in my name. The traditional avenues of financial salvation had been methodically boarded up and nailed shut. She was staring at the total collapse of her grand illusion. If she lost the Apex contract, she would be left with a quadrupled lease she could not pay and a business devoid of operating capital. She would be exposed as a complete fraud to her country club friends and humiliated in front of the high society she desperately wanted to join. She needed a massive injection of cash, and she needed it immediately. She was entirely cut off from the business world. The only avenue left was a devastating personal sacrifice. She had to find a way to guarantee the wholesale order using her own private assets. She was standing at the edge of the abyss, staring down into the darkness, completely unaware that I was the one who had dug the hole. All I had to do was wait for her to jump. I sat in the quiet darkness of my home office, watching the digital surveillance feed from the flower shop. The morning sun was just beginning to hit the front windows of the store. Patricia Palmer was pacing a tight circle behind the main counter. She had less than 4 hours to secure the inventory from the Bogota distributor, or the Phantom Apex Luxury Events contract would automatically self-destruct. Evelyn had been absolutely ruthless in her final communication the night before, stating that Apex did not tolerate delays and would simply award the multi-million-dollar gala circuit to a competitor if the supply chain was not verified by noon. I watched Patricia suffocating under the pressure. She picked up her cell phone and dialed a number. A few minutes later, a silver sports car pulled up to the curb outside the shop. Lance stepped out wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my daughter made in a month. He walked through the glass doors, looking highly annoyed that his mother had summoned him away from his supposed business meetings. Patricia did not argue with him. She simply picked up the thick, glossy Apex contract and shoved it across the oak counter. She tapped her manicured finger against the payment schedule and the projected revenue figures. I watched Lance read the document on the security monitor. His entire physical posture transformed in a matter of seconds. The arrogant annoyance melted away completely, replaced by a hungry, predatory intensity. He was looking at millions of dollars in guaranteed revenue. He was looking at the exact kind of elite high society validation he and his mother had spent their entire lives chasing. They were two parasites staring at the ultimate host, completely unaware that the host was made of poison. Patricia explained the logistical hurdle. She told him the exclusive South American distributor demanded a massive upfront deposit for the rare orchids, and she had drained the shop accounts dry to pay his previous demands. Lance did not yell or act like a coward this time. The sheer magnitude of the phantom wealth blinded him to all rational thought. He pulled out his own laptop and set it on the counter next to the Apex contract. He told his mother to get the distributor back on the phone so they could negotiate a corporate compromise. Patricia put my Bogota floor manager on speakerphone. The audio feed piped clearly into my office. Lance took the lead utilizing his best technology chief executive persona. He spoke with supreme confidence, attempting to leverage the massive Apex contract to force my manager to release the inventory without a deposit. He promised future equity and guaranteed recurring revenue for the distributor. He used every empty corporate buzzword he had memorized to impress his foolish investors. My manager was a professional trained to remain entirely devoid of emotion. He listened to Lance speak for 3 uninterrupted minutes. When Lance finally finished, my manager spoke in a flat, monotone voice. He stated that the distributor did not care about future equity or third-party contracts. He reiterated that the rare orchids were highly perishable assets that were currently receiving competing bids from buyers in Europe. He gave them a final ultimatum. Since they could not provide the full $100,000 deposit in liquid cash, the distributor would accept a hybrid security structure. They demanded $50,000 in immediate wired funds and a legally binding personal guarantee to cover the remaining balance and the total value of the shipment. A personal guarantee is the most lethal instrument in commercial finance. It instantly pierces the corporate veil. It strips away all the legal protections of a limited liability company and exposes the individual signer to absolute total liability. If the business defaults, the creditor can immediately seize the personal assets of the guarantor. My manager explained this reality with chilling clarity. He stated that the personal guarantee must be backed by a tangible, verified asset of equal or greater value. He suggested primary real estate. I watched Patricia hesitate. It was a fleeting moment of self-preservation. She was being asked to wager the roof over her head on a floral contract. But then she looked back down at the Apex paperwork. She saw the non-existent millions. She imagined the country club status and the power she would wield over the local society pages. The intoxicating lure of unearned wealth obliterated her survival instincts. She told the manager she owned a 4-bedroom estate in the historic district completely free of any mortgages. She offered her home as collateral without a second thought. Lance immediately agreed to fund the liquid portion of the demand. He logged into his startup banking portal and prepared to transfer $50,000. It was the absolute last drop of seed capital his investors had provided him. He was willingly draining the lifeblood of his own company to fund his mother's delusion. They were feeding on each other, entirely consumed by greed. My legal team in the corporate office generated the contracts in real time. They were flawless, merciless documents constructed to be ironclad under any legal scrutiny. The digital files were sent directly to the email address Patricia used for the shop. She opened them on the computer sitting on the oak counter. She hit print, and the machine hummed to life, spitting out the pages that would seal their fate. I watched through the camera as Patricia and Lance stood shoulder to shoulder over the paperwork. They did not read the fine print. They did not notice the harsh acceleration clauses or the immediate forfeiture conditions. They did not call an attorney to review the documents because they were terrified of missing Evelyn's noon deadline. They were acting entirely on blind panic and unrestrained avarice. Patricia picked up a pen. She leaned over the counter, the exact same counter where she had ruthlessly fired my grieving daughter just 24 hours prior. Patricia signed her full legal name on the bottom line. She formally pledged her historic estate, her primary residence, and all her personal assets to my holding company. She locked her own neck into the noose. Lance took the pen from her hand. He signed his name on the wire transfer authorization, officially liquidating his remaining investor capital. He secured the rope tight around his own throat, right next to his mother. They gathered the documents, scanned them into the computer, and transmitted the executed files back to the Bogota distributor. The confirmation arrived in my office 20 minutes later. $50,000 of stolen investor capital successfully cleared my offshore accounts. The personal guarantee securing Patricia Palmer's primary residence was officially registered and filed by my attorneys. The trap was no longer a theory. It was a binding, undeniable legal reality. My manager in Bogota sent a brief email to the flower shop, confirming receipt of the funds and the contracts. He informed them that the exotic orchids were officially dispatched and en route to their location. Patricia and Lance embraced each other in the middle of the store, celebrating their brilliant business acumen. They truly believed they had just outsmarted the entire commercial supply chain and secured their path to the elite upper class. They had no idea they had just handed me the deed to their destruction. The paperwork had cleared. The shipment was dispatched. The guillotine was raised and locked into position. All that remained was to let the blade drop. The heavy rumble of a commercial refrigerated transport truck broke the quiet morning air outside Petals and Pros. I sat parked half a block away, watching the final sequence of my design unfold. The truck backed slowly into the loading zone, its hydraulic brakes hissing as it settled into position. Patricia Palmer and her son Lance were already standing on the sidewalk. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. Patricia wore a pristine white blouse and a designer skirt projecting the image of a wildly successful corporate vendor. Lance stood beside her, checking his expensive watch and looking up and down the street to see if anyone was witnessing their monumental triumph. They believed those cargo containers held their golden ticket to the elite social circles of the city. The delivery driver stepped out of the cab and unlatched the heavy metal doors of the trailer. A thick cloud of cold condensation spilled out onto the pavement. Inside the cavernous hold sat 6 massive wooden shipping crates, stamped with the insignia of my Bogota distributor. Patricia watched with hungry eyes as the driver operated the hydraulic lift gate and lowered the pallets onto the sidewalk. She practically danced around the crates as the driver wheeled them directly into the center of the flower shop. When the final pallet was positioned, she snatched the delivery manifest from his clipboard and signed her name with a dramatic flourish. She did not bother to inspect the merchandise before dismissing the driver. Her arrogance simply would not allow her to imagine a scenario where she had been outsmarted. The moment the truck pulled away, Lance grabbed a heavy steel pry bar from the back office. I watched through the digital surveillance feed on my laptop as he wedged the metal bar under the lid of the largest crate. Patricia stood directly beside him, clapping her hands together in sheer delight. Lance threw his weight against the bar, and the wooden lid cracked open with a loud splintering sound. They did not see the ruin first. They smelled it. A wave of putrid, sickly sweet decay rolled out of the shipping crate. Patricia immediately recoiled, raising her manicured hand to cover her mouth and nose. Lance dropped the pry bar and staggered back, coughing violently. The smell of rotting vegetation was so dense and overwhelming, it practically clouded the camera feed. Patricia forced herself to step forward and peer inside the wooden box. The premium ghost orchids and exotic bromeliads she had mortgaged her entire life to secure were completely decimated. The delicate white petals were dissolved into a slimy black paste. The stems were covered in a thick web of dark gray mold. The entire $200,000 inventory was nothing more than a wet, rotting pile of agricultural compost. Lance frantically ripped open the second crate and then the third. Every single container revealed the exact same catastrophic devastation. The mechanism of this destruction was a masterpiece of biological and legal engineering. The flowers had been infected with a highly specific, aggressive agricultural fungus. It was a naturally occurring pathogen, completely harmless to human beings, but absolutely lethal to the aesthetic integrity of delicate orchids in transit. Because the fungus was a documented naturally occurring agricultural risk, my Bogotá distributor was entirely insulated from any legal liability. Furthermore, when Patricia and Lance blindly signed the rushed procurement contracts, they had voluntarily waived all standard agricultural inspection contingencies and insurance protections in order to meet the aggressive shipping deadline. They had legally assumed all risk the moment the crates left the South American tarmac. Patricia was hyperventilating. She plunged her bare hands into the rotting sludge, desperately trying to find a single surviving flower she could salvage. Her pristine white blouse was instantly stained with black mold and foul water. She was weeping hysterically, surrounded by the physical manifestation of her own greed. Lance was pacing the floor, gripping his hair and muttering, completely unable to process the total collapse of his stolen wealth. The final blow was delivered with absolute precision. Patricia had previously agreed to send Evelyn a verified photographic inventory report the moment the shipment arrived to prove she had secured the gala centerpieces. With her hands shaking violently, Patricia pulled out her cell phone. She snapped a picture of the rotting black sludge and texted it to the Apex Luxury Events procurement number, begging for an extension or a compromise. Evelyn called the shop exactly 60 seconds later. The phone rang loudly in the silent, foul-smelling room. Patricia answered it with a desperate, trembling voice, pleading with Evelyn to understand that the distributor had made a terrible mistake. Evelyn did not offer a single word of sympathy. Her voice, transmitted through the speakerphone, was as cold and hard as glacial ice. She informed Patricia that Apex Luxury Events did not accept excuses and did not tolerate failure. She stated that providing rotting compost for a high society gala was an unforgivable insult to their brand. Evelyn formally declared that Palmer Enterprises was in catastrophic breach of quality standards. She informed Patricia that the multi-million-dollar contract was immediately and permanently voided. Before Patricia could utter another desperate plea, Evelyn disconnected the line. The silence that fell over the flower shop was absolute. Patricia dropped her phone onto the floor where it shattered against the tile. She collapsed to her knees, landing directly in a puddle of foul black water, seeping from the wooden crates. Lance stared at his mother, his face entirely drained of color. The reality of their situation descended upon them like a collapsing concrete ceiling. There was no Apex contract. There were no upcoming galas. There was no million-dollar payout waiting to save them. They were standing in an empty, stolen building, surrounded by $200,000 of rotting garbage. They still owed my South American distributor $150,000 to satisfy the wholesale invoice. Lance had completely incinerated the last $50,000 of his startup capital, making him entirely destitute. And most devastating of all, Patricia had signed a legally binding personal guarantee. She had voluntarily pledged her historic estate and every personal asset she owned to secure a shipment of dead weeds. She had mortgaged her entire life to a phantom entity. I watched them weeping on the floor of the shop, completely broken and entirely trapped. They had willingly locked their own necks into the noose and eagerly kicked the chair out from under themselves. The execution was complete. The properties belonged to me now. It was time to walk through the front door and let them look their executioner in the eye. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the historic district. It was exactly 8 in the morning when the postal carrier deposited a thick stack of certified letters into the polished brass mailbox at the end of Patricia Palmer's driveway. I knew exactly what those heavy envelopes contained because my legal team had expedited their delivery. They were formal notices of default. The massive wholesale invoice for the ruined orchids had officially matured, and the grace period was completely extinguished. Because Patricia had willingly signed a binding personal guarantee, her prized residential estate was now legally targeted for immediate asset seizure. Patricia Palmer derived her entire sense of identity from that sprawling 4-bedroom house. The property was her ultimate status symbol. It was the physical proof she presented to her country club peers to validate her position in high society. The mere thought of a bank placing a public lien on her front door was a fate far worse than death. It meant absolute social ruin. It meant whispers in the grocery store and pitying glances at charity dinners. She would rather destroy everyone around her than suffer a single moment of public humiliation. I knew exactly how a narcissist would react when trapped in a corner. The initial shock of the rotting inventory had worn off overnight. The crushing reality of the $200,000 debt had settled deep into her bones. Patricia realized with terrifying clarity that the limited liability company she had stolen from my daughter was completely toxic. The flower shop was a financial crater. Lance was entirely bankrupt, having incinerated his last remaining dollar. They possessed absolutely no liquid capital to appease the South American distributor. Panic is a powerful solvent. It dissolves all rational thought and strips away any remaining moral boundaries. Patricia needed a scapegoat. She needed a sacrificial lamb to absorb the devastating financial impact of the collapsed Apex Luxury Events contract. She could not use Lance because his credit was already ruined by his failed technology startup. She needed someone with a clean financial history. She needed someone who had previously been associated with the business operations. She needed Alyssa. Even though Patricia had maliciously fired my grieving daughter and physically locked her out of the storefront, she knew Alyssa was still listed on the older commercial banking documents. Patricia believed that because Alyssa was young and deeply traumatized by the loss of her husband, she would be an easy target for financial manipulation. Patricia decided to anchor my daughter to the wreckage of the sinking ship to save herself from drowning. I was sitting in the quiet solitude of my home office staring at a grid of encrypted monitors. I had anticipated a desperate maneuver. The moment Patricia changed the locks on the flower shop, I had contacted a boutique cybersecurity firm. I instructed them to place a highly sensitive digital perimeter around every single piece of Alyssa Palmer's personal and financial data. I locked down her social security number, her banking profiles, and her credit history with military-grade monitoring software. If a single unauthorized entity attempted to access my daughter's identity, a silent alarm would trigger directly on my private server. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, the center monitor on my desk flashed a bright, solid red. The digital tripwire had been breached. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany desk. I did not blink as the data packet decrypted and populated across the screen. The alert was not a simple inquiry. It was a massive priority-tier commercial credit application. Someone was actively attempting to open a high-yield corporate line of credit for exactly $150,000. The amount was identical to the outstanding balance owed to my wholesale distributor. I tracked the origin point of the digital application. The request was completely bypassing local bank branches. It was being routed through an aggressive online commercial lending institution known for rapid approvals and minimal oversight. They catered to businesses needing emergency bridge loans, and they charged exorbitant fees for the privilege. I opened the specific details of the application. The primary applicant listed on the digital form was Alyssa Palmer. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. Patricia Palmer was sitting at the oak counter in the back office of the flower shop, actively committing federal wire fraud. She was taking the personal identification information she had harvested from the old employee files and using it to forge my daughter's digital signature on a massive corporate loan. Patricia was attempting to take the $150,000 debt she had incurred from the rotting orchids and strap it directly onto the back of a grieving widow. She was fully prepared to let my daughter face total financial annihilation just to protect her own historic home from a property lien. Patricia believed she was executing a brilliant invisible maneuver. She thought she could quietly secure the online funds, pay off the angry distributor, and leave Alyssa to deal with the predatory lending institution when the massive monthly statements began to arrive in the mail. Patricia assumed Alyssa would be too overwhelmed by grief and confusion to successfully fight the corporate debt. Patricia was wrong. I watched the keystrokes register in real time as Patricia filled out the final sections of the fraudulent loan application. She submitted the false income statements. She checked the box confirming she was the authorized applicant. She forged the digital signature and pressed submit. I did not intervene. I did not block the transmission or call the online lending institution to warn them. A hunter does not stop the prey from walking into the center of the cage. He simply waits for the door to lock. By clicking that submit button, Patricia Palmer had crossed a definitive, irreversible line. The conflict was no longer confined to civil disputes over commercial leases or broken supply chain contracts. Patricia had weaponized my daughter's identity. She had committed a severe felony in a desperate bid to save her own skin. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the pending approval icon spin on my encrypted monitor. I felt a cold, absolute clarity settle over the room. I reached for my phone and dialed the direct cellular number for my lead corporate attorney. I told him to immediately contact our private investigators and begin compiling a comprehensive federal fraud dossier. The financial vice I had constructed had worked perfectly. It had squeezed Patricia so tightly that her true criminal nature had ruptured out into the open. The trap was fully armed, and Patricia Palmer had just handed me the very weapon I would use to destroy her completely. Patricia Palmer had crossed a threshold from which there was absolutely no return. Financial manipulation and emotional abuse were toxic, but proving them in a court of law often required a lengthy, grueling battle of attrition. Federal wire fraud and identity theft, however, were entirely different creatures. They were absolute. They left indelible digital footprints that no high-priced defense attorney could ever erase. By attempting to open a massive corporate line of credit in my grieving daughter's name, Patricia had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her completely. She was no longer just a cruel mother-in-law trying to protect her fragile social status. She was an active felon operating completely outside the boundaries of the law. I reached for my encrypted phone and dialed Evelyn. She was my lead procurement officer for the Phantom Apex operation, but her background was firmly rooted in corporate forensic auditing and cybersecurity. I did not need to explain the emotional stakes to her. I only needed to give her the parameters of the digital breach. I told Evelyn that an unauthorized application for $150,000 had just been submitted to a predatory online lending institution using Alyssa Palmer's compromised credentials. I instructed her to trace the origin of the data packet bypass, any commercial firewalls they might be using, and isolate the exact point of transmission. Evelyn did not ask questions. She simply stated she would have the complete routing history within the hour. I sat in my quiet office watching the morning sun reflect off my monitor while the invisible gears of absolute justice began to turn. 50 minutes later, an encrypted file populated on my screen. Evelyn had not only traced the primary internet protocol address, but she had successfully mapped the entire digital sequence of the crime. The initial data transmission had originated precisely where I expected. It came directly from the commercial internet router located inside Petals and Pros. Patricia had utilized the shop's private network to commit the fraud, assuming the business account would mask her individual identity. She had chosen an aggressive online lending institution known for rapid approvals. She assumed the phantom loan would clear instantly, placing the cash directly into the business account to appease my angry South American distributor. She believed she could quietly pay off the debt, save her historic mansion from foreclosure, and leave Alyssa to deal with the catastrophic financial fallout when the massive monthly statements began arriving in the mail. But Evelyn dug much deeper than a simple router ping. She utilized specialized extraction software to identify the specific media access control address of the physical device used to fill out the application. Every piece of hardware leaves a unique permanent fingerprint on the network. The hardware signature Evelyn uncovered did not match the outdated desktop computer sitting on the oak counter in the flower shop. It matched a high-end, custom-built laptop. It was the exact make and model Lance carried in his leather satchel. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Patricia was not acting alone in a moment of isolated panic. She and her son were actively colluding. Lance had driven his silver sports car to the flower shop, not just to mourn the rotting exotic orchids, but to help his mother execute a catastrophic financial crime against his deceased brother's wife. Lance believed his background in technology startups made him invisible to standard fraud detection protocols. He thought his software would mask his location and hardware identifiers. He completely underestimated the level of surveillance I had established. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder in the back office using his sophisticated computer to digitally forge Alyssa's signature. Lance, the supposed technology genius, was utilizing his equipment to bypass basic security measures, while his mother provided the stolen social security number and banking details harvested from old employee files. They were working as a unified criminal enterprise to strap their massive, inescapable debt onto the back of a vulnerable widow. The sheer depth of their depravity eradicated any lingering trace of mercy I might have harbored. They were not just desperate, they were fundamentally evil. I opened a new secure folder on my encrypted server and began compiling the execution block. I uploaded the initial alerts from my financial monitoring software, capturing the exact moment the fraudulent application was submitted. I attached the detailed routing reports and hardware signatures Evelyn had just provided permanently, linking Lance to the crime. I integrated the time-stamped security footage showing mother and son sitting together in the shop, acting in unified desperation. I added the comprehensive records of Patricia's previous embezzlement from the limited liability company and the ruinous personal guarantee they had willingly signed the day before. I bound every single piece of undeniable proof into one lethal, comprehensive digital dossier. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It tracked their greed from the moment they stole the business to the exact second they committed federal wire fraud. It was a direct one-way ticket to federal prison for both of them. The conflict had finally reached its absolute zenith. I possessed all the necessary ammunition to contact the authorities and have them both quietly arrested in their homes before sunrise. A simple phone call to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with the transfer of my digital dossier, would end the nightmare instantly. The police would arrive, the handcuffs would click, and Patricia Palmer would disappear into the criminal justice system. But as I stared at the dense pages of criminal evidence, I realized a quiet arrest was completely insufficient. Handing them over to the authorities in the shadows would allow them to maintain their precious illusion of dignity. They would quietly hire expensive lawyers post-bail and spin a narrative of a tragic family misunderstanding to their wealthy country club friends. They would paint themselves as victims of a complex corporate error. They would seek sympathy from the very high society they had lied and stolen to impress. I could not allow them to control the narrative. They required something far more devastating than a silent exit in the back of an unmarked police cruiser. They needed to face the absolute destruction of their carefully crafted public image. I closed my laptop and stood up from my desk. I was going to strip away their freedom and their assets, but first I was going to strip away the only thing they valued more than money. I was going to orchestrate a public reckoning so vast and undeniable that they would never be able to show their faces in this city again. The evidence was secured. The trap was ready to spring. It was time to invite Patricia and Lance to their final grand event. Patricia Palmer was entirely blind to the invisible net that had already closed tightly around her throat. She firmly believed she could still outrun the catastrophic consequences of her actions. Desperation breeds profound delusion, and Patricia was completely intoxicated by her own elaborate lies. She looked at the rotting pile of exotic inventory and the looming shadow of federal fraud charges and decided her only viable escape route was to double down on the deception. She drained the very last remaining pennies from her personal checking accounts to fund one final grand illusion. She decided to host a massive expansion gala right in the middle of the stolen flower shop. Her frantic plan was to invite the wealthiest private investors in the city and solicit emergency capital under the guise of an exclusive branding opportunity. She rented expensive crystal chandeliers and hired a premium catering company she absolutely could not afford. She desperately wanted to blind the local elite with an overwhelming display of fake prosperity. But Patricia knew that cheap champagne and rented crystal would not be enough to open the closely guarded wallets of seasoned investors. She needed a highly compelling emotional narrative to successfully sell her fraudulent pitch. She sank to the absolute lowest depth of human depravity to find her perfect prop. She needed someone to generate overwhelming pity and pry open the floodgates of local charity. She picked up her phone and called Alyssa. Patricia ruthlessly demanded that my grieving daughter attend the opulent event. She ordered Alyssa to stand quietly in the corner of the room and play the role of the helpless, dependent widow who was graciously being supported by the thriving Palmer family business. Patricia actually believed she could parade my daughter around the room like a wounded rescue animal to extort sympathy investments from the wealthy attendees. She wanted Alyssa to smile sadly and nod while Patricia essentially stole money from strangers to cover the massive debts she had incurred by ruining the commercial enterprise. Under normal circumstances, that cruel phone call would have shattered Alyssa completely. It would have been the final devastating push that completely broke her spirit. But Alyssa was no longer wandering alone in the dark. I had already visited her quiet apartment and revealed the entire scope of the operation. I had shown her the undeniable digital evidence of Patricia and Lance actively forging her name on a massive corporate loan. I had carefully explained exactly how the financial vice was constructed and how it was about to snap completely shut on their greedy fingers. Alyssa did not cry when Patricia issued her vile demands over the phone. My daughter simply listened to the frantic instructions and calmly agreed to attend the event. Alyssa hung up the receiver and looked at me with a newfound brilliant clarity in her eyes. The profound, heavy grief that had consumed her for months was suddenly replaced by an unbreakable spine of quiet, hardened steel. She understood with absolute certainty that she was not walking into an ambush. She was walking into a trap where she held the detonator. The night of the gala arrived with a bitter, stinging chill in the air. I parked my unmarked car 3 blocks away from the brightly lit flower shop and watched the luxury vehicles pull up to the velvet-roped valet stand. Patricia had somehow managed to scrub the foul, putrid stench of the rotting orchids from the main showroom floor. She had pushed the decaying wooden crates into the dark back alley and masked the lingering odor with heavy industrial air fresheners and hundreds of cheap, burning candles. She stood by the front entrance wearing an aggressively expensive evening gown she had purchased on fraudulent corporate credit. She greeted the wealthy local investors with a bright, manic smile that bordered on pure terror-driven hysteria. Lance stood closely by her side, holding a crystal glass of champagne and pretending to be a wildly successful technology pioneer. They were two desperate actors performing on a fragile stage that was actively catching fire underneath their feet. Alyssa arrived exactly 30 minutes after the heavy glass doors opened to the public. She did not wear the dreary conservative mourning clothes Patricia had explicitly expected her to wear. My daughter walked into the crowded room wearing a sharp, elegant dark suit that radiated absolute, undeniable authority. She did not shrink into the shadows or cast her eyes toward the polished floor. She stood tall in the very center of the showroom, calmly watching Patricia spin her desperate web of lies to the captive audience of wealthy investors. Patricia spotted her immediately and rushed over with forced enthusiasm. She aggressively grabbed Alyssa's arm and tried to pull her toward a tight group of potential affluent donors. Patricia began to weave a completely fictitious, tragic story about how the generous Palmer family was selflessly supporting this poor lost widow through her darkest financial days. She fully expected Alyssa to lower her head and play the pathetic, broken victim. She expected my daughter to validate the massive public illusion. Alyssa simply looked at Patricia with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. My daughter refused to follow the degrading script. She calmly pulled her arm away from Patricia's desperate, grasping fingers and took a deliberate, powerful step back. The surrounding investors watched the strange, tense interaction with growing visible confusion. The flawless, shiny illusion of the happy, prosperous family was beginning to fracture right in front of their eyes. Patricia panicked and tried to force a loud, bubbly laugh to cover the sudden, awkward, heavy silence descending on the room. Her eyes darted wildly around the showroom, looking for any possible distraction to save her collapsing narrative. She had absolutely no idea that her ultimate destruction had already arrived. She did not know that I was currently walking through the heavy glass doors at the front of the room holding a leather folder filled with lethal documents. It was finally time to pull back the heavy curtain and let the entire city see the desperate thieving monsters hiding in the dark. The interior of the flower shop was a grotesque monument to false prosperity. Patricia Palmer had packed the main showroom with the wealthiest and most influential citizens of the city. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive catered appetizers and crystal flutes of imported champagne. Patricia had draped the walls in sheer fabric and hung heavy glass chandeliers from the ceiling to create an atmosphere of overwhelming luxury. She was desperately attempting to project the image of an unstoppable corporate empire. But no amount of sheer fabric or expensive perfume could completely mask the underlying truth of her situation. Beneath the aroma of roasted garlic and expensive champagne, a faint, sickly sweet stench lingered in the air. It was the undeniable smell of the rotting orchids she had hidden in the back alley. The wealthy investors smiled and nodded polite greetings to one another, completely unaware that they were standing in a financial graveyard. Patricia moved through the room with manic energy. She wore a stunning evening gown and a bright, predatory smile. She was methodically working her way through the clusters of affluent guests, weaving a masterful tapestry of lies. She spoke of massive international supply chain contracts and exclusive society galas. She painted herself as a visionary entrepreneur who was simply looking for a few elite partners to share in her monumental success. Lance stood nearby in his tailored suit, echoing her fabricated statistics and promising astronomical returns on their emergency capital investments. They were completely surrounded by their ultimate target audience. They were minutes away from passing the hat and collecting the lifeline they needed to save their historic estate. Alyssa stood in the very center of the room like a solitary pillar of truth in a sea of deception. My daughter wore her elegant dark suit and watched her former tormentors spin their desperate web. Patricia kept trying to physically pull Alyssa into the conversations, hoping to use the grieving widow as a pathetic prop to extract sympathy donations. But Alyssa refused to play the victim. She simply stood her ground and stared at Patricia with a look of absolute cold pity. The investors were beginning to notice the strange, disjointed dynamic. The flawless illusion of the happy, prosperous family was starting to show deep, visible cracks. The wealthy guests exchanged confused glances and shifted uncomfortably, holding their crystal glasses tightly against their chests. That was the exact moment I walked through the heavy glass doors of the flower shop. I did not enter the room wearing the faded denim jeans and worn flannel shirts that Patricia had always associated with my presence. I had completely discarded the humble disguise I wore during the months I spent quietly building this trap. I stepped into the bright showroom wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that had been tailored to absolute perfection. It was the armor of a man who commanded international holding companies and dictated terms to global supply chains. The physical transformation was total and undeniable. I was no longer the quiet, grieving father sitting in the corner of the room. I was the architect of their destruction, stepping out of the shadows to admire my finished work. I was not alone. Evelyn walked precisely one step behind my right shoulder. She wore a sharp black business suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase. Her face was a mask of pure corporate lethality. Flanking us on either side were two broad-shouldered men in unremarkable plain clothes. They were seasoned financial crimes detectives from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with the quiet, heavy authority of men who possessed the absolute power to strip away freedom. Each detective held a thick manila folder containing the comprehensive digital dossier I had compiled. Those folders held the undeniable proof of wire fraud and identity theft. They held the digital fingerprints that linked Lance and Patricia directly to a severe federal felony. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind us. The sharp sound echoed through the showroom. The dense crowd of wealthy investors nearest the entrance turned to look at the newcomers. The casual, polite chatter immediately died in our vicinity. The silence spread through the room like a drop of ink in a glass of water, radiating outward until the entire gala was completely quiet. The attendees instinctively parted, creating a wide, clear path across the polished tile floor. They recognized the sudden shift in the atmosphere. They could feel the immense, crushing weight of consequence entering the building. Patricia was standing near the back of the showroom, holding a glass of champagne and speaking to a prominent local banker. She noticed the sudden silence and turned her head to see what was causing the disruption. Her eyes locked onto my face. For one brief fraction of a second, I saw genuine confusion register in her expression. She did not immediately recognize the man standing in the doorway in the bespoke charcoal suit. Her brain could not reconcile the image of the powerful executive with the subservient old man she had so casually dismissed. But then the recognition finally settled into her mind. The confusion vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. Patricia Palmer truly believed she was untouchable. She believed she had successfully isolated and defeated every obstacle in her path. Seeing me standing in the middle of her desperate fundraising gala felt like a personal insult to her manufactured authority. Her fake smile twisted into a grotesque, hateful snarl. She slammed her crystal glass down onto a nearby cocktail table, spilling champagne across the white linen cloth. She was completely blind to the plainclothes detectives flanking my sides. She was completely oblivious to the manila folders containing her certain doom. She only saw an annoying old man attempting to ruin her final grand performance. Patricia marched across the polished tile floor, her heels clicking sharply in the dead silence of the room. She raised her hand and aggressively signaled the two large security guards she had hired to work the front door. She projected her voice so every single wealthy investor in the room could hear her cruel narrative. She loudly announced that her poor, confused father-in-law was experiencing a severe senile episode and needed to be immediately escorted out of the building for his own safety. She tried to frame my arrival as a tragic medical emergency to preserve her flawless public image. She ordered the muscular guards to grab my arms and physically drag me out onto the street. She intended to humiliate me in front of the entire city elite and throw me out like garbage. She wanted to prove her absolute dominance over the territory she had stolen. She never reached me. Before Patricia could cross the final 10 feet of empty space, the two federal detectives stepped forward and blocked her path. They moved with a smooth, coordinated precision that instantly halted her aggressive advance. The hired security guards froze in their tracks, recognizing the unmistakable stance of law enforcement officers. Patricia stopped abruptly, her chest heaving with manufactured indignation. She opened her mouth to demand that these strangers step aside and allow her security team to remove the senile intruder. The lead detective did not give her the opportunity to speak. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his gold federal badge. He held it up under the bright crystal chandeliers, ensuring that every wealthy investor in the room could clearly see the ultimate symbol of governmental authority. The shiny metal caught the light and cast a blinding reflection across Patricia's pale, shocked face. The detective calmly opened the thick manila folder and pulled out a stack of paper. He did not lower his voice to spare her dignity. He spoke with a loud, clear, booming authority that resonated off the glass walls of the flower shop. He formally announced that he possessed an active federal warrant for the immediate arrest of Patricia Palmer and Lance Palmer. He stated that the charges included massive commercial wire fraud, severe identity theft, and criminal conspiracy to defraud a financial institution. The entire room gasped in unified horror. The wealthy investors physically backed away from Patricia, as if she were suddenly infected with a deadly disease. The flawless illusion she had sacrificed her soul to maintain shattered into a million jagged pieces. The phantom millions evaporated into thin air, leaving her completely naked and exposed to the unforgiving judgment of the exact society she desperately wanted to join. She was no longer a visionary corporate leader. She was a common, desperate thief caught completely red-handed in the middle of her own extravagant lie. Patricia stood completely frozen, staring blankly at the federal badge. Her eyes darted wildly toward Lance, who was currently dropping his champagne glass onto the floor in absolute terror. The trap had finally sprung shut with bone-crushing force. There would be no escape, and there would be no mercy. The hired security guards stood completely frozen, resembling stone statues, as the federal detectives held their gold badges under the bright crystal chandeliers. Patricia Palmer was entirely paralyzed by the sudden display of absolute governmental authority. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream of sheer panic. I did not waste a single glance on her. I did not pause to acknowledge her pathetic manufactured outrage. I bypassed her entirely, stepping smoothly around her frozen figure as if she were nothing more than a meaningless piece of discarded furniture. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the faint, lingering odor of rotting vegetation. I walked directly toward the center of the showroom, moving with the heavy, measured steps of a man who held the fate of everyone in the building firmly in his hands. A small wooden podium stood at the front of the room, where Patricia had intended to deliver her desperate, fraudulent sales pitch. A string quartet was seated near the window, playing a cheerful, classical melody that felt completely absurd against the suffocating tension rapidly spreading across the floor. I stepped up onto the small raised platform and positioned myself directly behind the podium. The wealthy investors were already staring at me with growing confusion and deep unease. I reached forward and firmly tapped the metal head of the microphone with my index finger. A sharp, piercing squeal of audio feedback ripped through the showroom. The high-pitched sound instantly cut through the polite murmurs and the clinking of crystal glasses. The musicians jumped in their seats and abruptly stopped playing their instruments. The sudden heavy silence that crashed down over the gala was absolute and terrifying. Every single face in the crowded room turned toward the podium. 130 influential citizens of the city stared up at me, waiting for an explanation. I leaned into the microphone. My voice echoed through the massive room, calm, cold, and perfectly steady. I did not introduce myself as a grieving father. I did not mention my daughter, Alyssa, or the profound suffering this vile family had inflicted upon her. Emotional appeals hold absolutely no weight in a room full of corporate predators. I spoke to them in the only language they truly respected. I introduced myself by my full legal name and my official corporate title. I stated clearly and deliberately that I was the chief executive officer of the International Commercial Trust that owned the very building they were currently standing inside. I watched the realization ripple through the front row of wealthy guests. They understood instantly that Patricia Palmer was not the master of her own domain. She was merely a temporary tenant standing on my floor. I did not stop there. I raised my voice so it carried to the darkest corners of the showroom. I announced that my holding company was the sole international proprietor of the South American agricultural distributor that had provided the floral inventory for the evening. I informed the elite crowd that Palmer Enterprises was currently in default on a massive wholesale invoice totaling $200,000. I let that massive financial figure hang in the dead silent air, allowing the wealthy investors to fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of the impending bankruptcy. I stated that I was the primary lien holder of their debt and the legal owner of the binding personal guarantee that gave me absolute direct control over the historic Palmer estate. I watched the color completely drain from the faces of the affluent attendees. The flawless illusion of the thriving family business disintegrated before their very eyes. They realized they had not been invited to an exclusive branding opportunity. They had been lured into a sinking ship by a desperate captain begging for a financial life raft. The investors instinctively began to take slow, deliberate steps backward, physically distancing themselves from the toxic epicenter of the room. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium and delivered the final devastating blow. I addressed the crowd directly, warning them that the woman who had poured their champagne tonight was not seeking business partners. She was actively seeking accomplices to a severe federal felony. I pointed toward the heavy glass doors where the two federal detectives were currently standing guard. I announced to the entire room that less than 3 hours ago I had personally filed a comprehensive federal wire fraud report against the host of the gala. I explained with absolute ruthless clarity that Patricia and Lance Palmer had utilized stolen identity data to forge a massive corporate loan application in a pathetic, frantic attempt to absorb their catastrophic financial collapse. The collective gasp that erupted from the crowd was a beautiful symphony of total social destruction. The wealthy elite of the city recoiled in genuine horror. Financial ruin was considered a terrible misfortune in their circles, but federal wire fraud was an unforgivable disease. The room fractured as the attendees frantically whispered to one another, desperate to escape the building before their own reputations were stained by the association. I looked past the sea of panicked investors and found Patricia Palmer standing near the back wall. The devastating weight of my public declaration had physically crushed her. The arrogant, aggressive posture had completely vanished. She was a hollowed-out shell, staring at the absolute annihilation of her entire existence. She had spent her life worshipping social status and fake prosperity. Now she was being publicly exposed as a desperate, broke criminal in front of the exact society she had destroyed my daughter to impress. Her manicured fingers simply stopped working. All the strength abandoned her hands. The expensive crystal champagne flute she had been gripping slipped through her fingers. It fell through the empty air and struck the polished tile floor. The glass shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The sharp breaking sound echoed perfectly across the quiet room, marking the exact final second of her ruined life. Lance was standing 3 feet away from his mother, completely paralyzed by terror. He was staring at the federal detectives with wide, unblinking eyes, finally realizing that his stolen investor capital and his foolish arrogance had led him directly into a federal prison cell. He did not try to run. He did not try to argue. The sheer, overwhelming presence of undeniable consequences stripped away his ability to breathe. I stepped down from the wooden podium, leaving the microphone behind. The crowd parted instantly, allowing me to walk freely through the center of the showroom. I did not look back at Patricia or Lance. They were no longer my concern. I had successfully dismantled their finances, their social standing, and their freedom. I walked toward the front entrance where my daughter Alyssa was waiting. She stood tall and unbothered, completely untouched by the chaos erupting around her. The long, dark nightmare was over, and the natural order had finally been restored. Patricia stood frozen in the center of the opulent showroom, her mind frantically searching for a way out of the inescapable trap. She opened her mouth to speak, hoping to weave one final desperate lie to the wealthy onlookers who were currently backing away from her. She wanted to claim the federal detectives were imposters or that this was all a massive corporate misunderstanding. She needed to preserve the fragile illusion of her high society status just for a few more minutes. But the machinery of her destruction was already in motion, and I had no intention of allowing her to utter another single word of deception. I gave a subtle nod to Evelyn, who was standing patiently at my side, holding the thick leather briefcase. Evelyn moved through the tense, silent room with the lethal grace of a seasoned corporate executioner. She unclasped the brass locks of her briefcase and produced thick stacks of heavily documented financial dossiers. She did not hand them to the detectives or to Patricia. Evelyn walked directly into the crowd of affluent investors and began distributing the meticulously compiled portfolios to the most prominent figures in the room. She handed one to the local bank president Patricia had been cornering earlier. She handed another to a wealthy real estate developer and another to a prominent society matron. Evelyn moved seamlessly, distributing the absolute undeniable truth of Patricia and Lance to the exact people they had been trying to defraud. The investors opened the folders and looked down at the irrefutable proof of a massive criminal conspiracy. The first page they saw was the digital log of the fraudulent corporate loan application. They read how Patricia Palmer had actively stolen the identity of a grieving young widow to forge a massive line of credit. The wealthy elite of the city stared at the time-stamped internet protocol addresses and the hardware signatures that proved Lance had used his own personal computer to facilitate the federal wire fraud. They saw the exact moment mother and son had colluded to strap their catastrophic debt onto the back of an innocent woman just to save their own comfortable lives. As the affluent guests turned the pages, the depths of the depravity only grew darker. Evelyn had included the complete banking history of the limited liability company Patricia had stolen. The investors read the detailed ledgers showing how Patricia had systematically drained the daily operating funds of the flower shop. They saw the relentless transfer of capital from the legitimate business directly into the offshore accounts funding the doomed technology startup Lance had created. The crowd realized they were not looking at a visionary entrepreneur who needed emergency capital to expand a thriving floral empire. They were looking at a common embezzler who had starved her own business to death to fund the delusions of her arrogant son. The final document in the portfolio completely shattered the physical reality of the gala. The investors read the formal notices of default regarding the commercial property itself. They saw the ironclad lease agreements proving that Patricia did not own the building and had absolutely no legal right to stand on the polished tile floor. The documents revealed that she was completely bankrupt, facing immediate eviction and drowning in a massive wholesale debt for the rotting orchids hidden in the back alley. The glossy promotional brochures Patricia had handed out earlier, promising astronomical returns on their investments, were exposed as completely worthless pieces of paper. The entire evening was a masterfully constructed con designed to steal their money to plug a hole in a sinking ship. I watched the atmosphere in the room shift from confused shock to absolute visceral disgust. The wealthy elite are fiercely protective of their capital and their social standing. They realized how dangerously close they had come to handing their money over to active federal felons. The polished smiles and polite murmurs completely vanished, replaced by cold, hard glares directed squarely at Patricia and Lance. The quiet whispers spreading through the crowd were no longer filled with admiration or curiosity. They were filled with sheer revulsion. The investors realized that the faint, sickly sweet smell permeating the room was not an exotic floral arrangement, but the literal stench of decay mirroring the moral rot of the hosts. The exodus began with the local bank president. He dropped the glossy expansion brochure onto a nearby cocktail table, brushing his hands together as if to wipe away a layer of invisible grime. He turned his back on Patricia without saying a single word and walked straight out the front doors into the cool morning air. The rest of the crowd immediately followed his lead. The wealthy developers, the society matrons, and the affluent donors all dropped their champagne flutes and their promotional materials. They abandoned the false luxury of the showroom, eager to escape the suffocating presence of failure and criminality. They filed past the federal detectives, completely ignoring the desperate, frantic noises Patricia was making in the background. Patricia reached out her trembling hands toward the departing guests, begging them to stay and listen to her side of the story. She watched the absolute destruction of her social standing walking out the door. The very people she had worshipped, the elite circle she had sacrificed her soul to join, were now looking at her like a piece of rotting garbage. She was entirely erased from high society in a matter of minutes. No one would ever answer her phone calls again. No one would ever invite her to another charity dinner. She was permanently exiled from the only world she cared about. Her grand facade was stripped away, leaving her completely naked and exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. Lance remained frozen beside the rented crystal chandeliers, watching the wealthy investors abandon him. His tailored suit suddenly looked ridiculous on his shrinking frame. He had spent his entire adult life pretending to be a technology pioneer, relying on the stolen wealth of his mother to fund his arrogant lifestyle. Now he saw the irrefutable evidence of his own federal crimes printed in black and white and distributed to the public. The illusion of his brilliance evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, incompetent fraud. He looked at the plainclothes detectives standing by the entrance and finally understood that his life of unearned luxury was permanently over. He was going to a place where his expensive watches and corporate buzzwords meant absolutely nothing. Within 5 minutes, the opulent showroom was completely empty of guests. The string quartet had packed their instruments and fled out the back exit. The caterers had abandoned the silver trays of food and disappeared into the morning. The only people left inside the massive glass walls were the federal detectives, Evelyn, Alyssa, myself, and the 2 broken criminals standing in the center of the room. Patricia and Lance were entirely isolated in the middle of their ruined kingdom. They were surrounded by empty champagne glasses, discarded promotional brochures, and the inescapable stench of their own decay. They had tried to build an empire on a foundation of theft and deception, and I had simply removed the ground beneath their feet. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind the last departing investor. The opulent showroom was suddenly transformed into a tomb of rented crystal and wilting floral arrangements. The suffocating silence was broken only by the sharp, synchronized footsteps of the 2 federal detectives moving deliberately across the polished floor. They did not shout. They did not need to draw their weapons. The sheer gravity of their presence was an overwhelming force of nature. They locked their eyes on Lance Palmer. The spoiled, arrogant heir was trembling violently beside the catering table. His tailored suit looked 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He stared at the thick manila folder in the lead detective's hand. The reality of his catastrophic digital trail finally penetrated his thick skull. He realized the encrypted routing numbers and the forged data packets had not made him an invisible technology genius. They had built a direct highway to a federal prison cell. Panic is a primal instinct that strips away all logical thought. Lance looked at the approaching federal agents, and his fragile mind completely fractured. He dropped the expensive silver serving tray he had been gripping for support. The heavy metal clattered loudly against the tile. Lance spun around and blindly bolted toward the dark hallway that led to the rear delivery alley. He moved with the frantic, sloppy desperation of a trapped animal. He truly believed he could simply outrun a massive federal indictment by sprinting out the back door of a stolen flower shop. He did not make it very far. The younger detective moved with terrifying, explosive speed. He crossed the showroom floor in 3 massive strides and intercepted the fleeing coward before Lance even reached the swinging wooden doors. The physical collision was brutal and decisive. The detective aggressively slammed his shoulder into Lance, driving the breathless young man hard against the heavy wooden delivery doors. The impact rattled the hinges and knocked the remaining wind from Lance's lungs. Lance let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine as the detective violently twisted his arms behind his back. The cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his pale wrists with a loud metallic click that echoed sharply across the empty showroom. The detective read him his rights in a flat, mechanical voice, citing the specific statutes for severe commercial wire fraud and criminal identity theft. Lance Palmer, the man who had casually forged a grieving widow's signature to steal thousands of dollars, was suddenly reduced to a sobbing, broken child thrashing weakly against the unyielding grip of federal law enforcement. I did not watch them drag the weeping coward away from the doors. My focus was entirely fixed on Patricia. She stood completely paralyzed behind the main oak counter. All the blood had rapidly drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of dirty chalk. She was staring at her handcuffed son with wide, unblinking eyes, unable to process the absolute destruction of her bloodline. Her entire world had been surgically dismantled in less than 10 minutes. The wealthy society she worshipped had abandoned her. The business she stole was bankrupt. The historic mansion she lived in was facing imminent foreclosure. She had absolutely nothing left but the expensive rented dress clinging to her trembling body. I walked slowly across the empty floor. My heavy leather shoes tapped a steady, ominous rhythm against the tile. I stepped directly up to the oak counter and looked down at the broken woman. She slowly shifted her gaze away from her arrested son and looked up at me. Her eyes were hollow and completely devoid of the arrogant defiance she had wielded for so many months. I reached inside the pocket of my bespoke charcoal suit and withdrew a single sheet of heavy legal paper. I placed it gently onto the polished wood of the counter, right next to her trembling hands. I produced a silver fountain pen and laid it meticulously beside the document. This was not a standard corporate contract. This was the final absolute instrument of her total surrender. I had spent weeks auditing the chaotic legal framework of her stolen empire. I discovered exactly how Patricia had manipulated the estate courts to seize control of the limited liability company. More importantly, I uncovered the darkest, cruelest secret she had buried. She had forcefully retained the lucrative life insurance policy belonging to her deceased son, Blake. She had ruthlessly denied Alyssa a single penny of her husband's death benefits, using obscure legal loopholes to hoard the cash for her own selfish vanity. And in her most depraved act of control, Patricia had legally withheld Blake's ashes, keeping the urn locked away in her historic mansion to inflict maximum emotional torture upon my grieving daughter. She had used the physical remains of a dead man as a weapon to demand absolute obedience from a vulnerable widow. I tapped the silver pen against the heavy paper. The document I presented demanded the immediate, unconditional relinquishment of everything she had stolen. It dictated the total transfer of the limited liability company back into Alyssa's rightful name. It required the immediate unfreezing and release of Blake's entire life insurance policy. And above all else, it demanded the permanent, undisputed transfer of Blake's ashes directly into the hands of his legal wife. There were no negotiations. There were no financial settlements. It was a complete capitulation of every single cruel advantage Patricia Palmer had ever possessed. Patricia stared down at the bold black letters printed on the page. She opened her mouth to protest, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She looked back at the federal detective who was currently tightening the steel cuffs around Lance's pale wrists. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat against the oak counter. I lowered my voice to a cold, lethal whisper that cut directly through her terrified silence. I told Patricia to sign the paper immediately, or I would instruct the detectives to execute the second arrest warrant waiting in their manila folder. I made it absolutely clear that she was currently standing at the exact intersection of a signature and a federal prison cell. She had a choice to walk out of this building as a penniless, disgraced failure, or to be dragged out in chains right behind her sobbing son. She looked into my eyes and saw the absolute truth. I was not bluffing. I possessed all the undeniable digital proof required to lock her away for the rest of her natural life. I had the bank logs, the forged applications, and the recorded internet protocols. I held the entire sum of her criminal greed in the palm of my hand. Patricia Palmer, the woman who had spent months laughing at my daughter's profound suffering, finally broke. A loud, wretched sob escaped her throat. She reached out with violently shaking hands and picked up the silver fountain pen. Her fingers trembled so severely she could barely grip the metal barrel. She pressed the ink to the heavy paper and signed her name. The signature was sloppy and erratic, reflecting the total collapse of her shattered mind. She surrendered the stolen business, she surrendered the hoarded insurance money, and she finally surrendered the ashes of her dead son. The pen clattered onto the wooden counter. Patricia covered her face with her hands and wept loudly in the center of the silent, empty room. The natural order was permanently restored. The morning sun crested over the city skyline, casting pale rays of light through the heavy glass storefront. The atmosphere inside the building had been completely transformed over a single night. The suffocating stench of rotting exotic orchids was gone. The harsh chemical bite of industrial bleach had been eradicated. In their place, a crisp, clean aroma drifted through the quiet showroom. It was the rich, earthy scent of fresh potting soil mingling with the delicate fragrance of blooming blue hydrangeas. The deep shadows that had clung to the corners of the room during Patricia Palmer's reign had been washed away by the brilliant light. I pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The showroom was completely silent, but it was no longer the terrified silence of a collapsing criminal enterprise. It was the peaceful quiet of a fresh start. I found Alyssa standing quietly behind the main oak counter. She wore a simple, comfortable linen blouse, and her hair was tied back in a loose, practical knot. She was gently running a damp cloth over the polished wood, wiping away the last invisible remnants of Patricia's frantic grip. My daughter looked up as I approached, and for the first time in nearly a year, I saw genuine life shining in her eyes. The hollow shadows of profound grief and financial terror had vanished from her face. She did not look like a broken dependent widow waiting to be rescued. She looked like a woman who had finally woken up from a terrible nightmare and realized she was safe. She placed the damp cloth on the counter and smiled at me, holding the quiet strength of a survivor. I walked up to the counter and reached inside the inner pocket of my jacket. I withdrew a thick, heavy envelope made of crisp white parchment. I laid the envelope flat on the polished oak surface and gently slid it across the distance between us. Alyssa looked down at the parchment and then back up at my face. Her fingers were completely steady as she broke the wax seal and withdrew the stack of legal documents. The first page was the absolute uncontested deed to the commercial building they were currently standing inside. It proved that the physical ground beneath her feet was permanently hers. The second stack of papers contained the immaculate operating agreements and the flawlessly audited financial records for a newly established corporate entity. I watched her eyes scan the bold black ink. The business was legally incorporated as Blake's Garden. I kept my voice perfectly steady as I explained the exact nature of the paperwork. I told my daughter that the new entity was entirely free of any wholesale debt, commercial liens, or personal guarantees. The suffocating financial vice Patricia had constructed to crush her had been completely dismantled. The business belonged solely to Alyssa. There were no silent partners, no hidden clauses, and absolutely no strings attached to the Palmer family. She held the absolute authority to run the shop, however she saw fit to honor her husband's memory. She had finally been given the safe, secure foundation she needed to simply grieve and eventually rebuild. As the absolute reality of her new freedom settled into her mind, I watched the physical tension completely leave her body. The invisible armor she had been forced to wear for months simply melted away. Her shoulders dropped and a shuddering breath escaped her lips. Alyssa closed her eyes, and a single silent tear rolled down her cheek, falling onto the polished oak counter. It was a quiet release of pure, overwhelming relief. She stepped around the edge of the counter and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. She buried her face against my chest and held on to me with incredible strength. We stood there in the quiet, fragrant showroom, simply existing in the peaceful aftermath of the silent reckoning. The true inheritance had been safely delivered. As I held my daughter, my encrypted cellular phone suddenly buzzed with a sharp, rapid vibration inside my jacket pocket. I gently pulled away from Alyssa's embrace and reached for the device. I illuminated the screen and saw a secure text message waiting from Evelyn. The message was characteristically brief and ruthlessly efficient. Evelyn informed me that Patricia's historic estate was officially scheduled to go to public auction next Tuesday morning due to immediate aggressive foreclosure proceedings. The message ended with a simple cold question, asking if we should place a quiet, anonymous bid to purchase the mansion out from under her. It was the ultimate temptation of absolute vengeance. I could easily buy the very house Patricia loved more than her own soul and turn her cherished sanctuary into a final monument of defeat. I did not feel a sudden surge of sadistic joy at the prospect of buying her ruined estate. I felt absolutely nothing for Patricia Palmer or her imprisoned son. The burning righteous anger that had driven my meticulous orchestration for months had completely extinguished itself. I had simply forced them to face the brutal consequences of their own monstrous arrogance. I had merely removed the stolen pillars supporting their lives and allowed gravity to do the rest. My ultimate objective was never to dance on their graves or revel in their public humiliation. My only true purpose was to eradicate the immediate threat they posed to my vulnerable daughter and completely neutralize their ability to cause further harm. The parasites had been successfully excised from the host. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the digital screen and permanently deleted Evelyn's message. I locked the screen, sliding the dark phone back into my pocket. I looked at Alyssa one final time. She was already walking back around the oak counter, carefully arranging a fresh display of white lilies. She looked peaceful, focused, and completely untouchable. The architecture of her life was finally secure, and the natural order of the world was fully restored. I did not say goodbye or offer any lingering emotional advice. I turned around and walked quietly toward the front of the shop. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the busy morning pavement. The city was wide awake and the streets were filled with the loud, rushing noise of daily traffic. I adjusted the collar of my jacket and smoothly blended into the dense, rushing crowd of commuters. I was no longer an executioner. I was just an ordinary man quietly returning to the shadows. The most profound lesson embedded within this narrative is the vital distinction between securing justice and indulging in blind vengeance. When confronted with deep betrayal and malicious greed, the protagonist utilizes extreme calculated precision to dismantle the threat and restore safety to his vulnerable daughter. However, once the parasitic elements are excised and the natural order is re-established, he actively chooses to walk away rather than inflict further unnecessary suffering. This demonstrates that true power lies not in the infinite capacity to destroy your enemies, but in the disciplined restraint to stop fighting once absolute peace has been successfully secured. If you found this story compelling and wish to explore more narratives of calculated justice, please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the final outcome.